And
Well, Heavenly Father, thank you that your Son brings us into a state of wonder before you. Thank you that he does renew our hearts and our minds. Thank you that it is the desire of your Spirit to remake us in your image. So, Father, as we embark on this mammoth journey, we thank you for Tom. We thank you for his parents. We thank you for his brother. We thank you for, yes, I'll use the word dynasty. Thank you, Father, that you are the God of all fatherhood from whom all families derive. So bless our time together now. Kick us off with much love, much grace. For Jesus' sake, amen.
amen. Thank you, Bryden. Good. Well, today, for those of you who are here, you all know this, but for those who will be watching, which some of our videos, we have over 200 or 300 people who are watching the follow-up videos. So I think it's rather exciting to know that people are following, and though we may be relatively small, the quality is high and the follow-up is rich and good. So today we are beginning a significant, nicely thick, and much read by me book, Theological Science by T.F. Torrance. And just to say 2 words about the title, theological, is going to be something that is going to be the roots of who Thomas Torrance is, and even his work with Karl Barth, we would have to say, was a movement into theological science. The dogmatics begin. Christian dogmatics is the church's scientific self-examination of its distinctive talk about God. So you can see even in the opening affirmation of the church dogmatics, the scientific work is something that is right in there. And so there is something of that even that comes out in this work. So to say theological means it is mostly and firstly and appropriately about God. And then there's this word science, which throughout this work, we're going to see that we cannot adopt merely a humanly arranged or humanly defined term for science, but that we must recognize that the word science itself needs to be investigated so as to serve the nature of whatever is under investigation. So science is going to be investigative. Torrance in this work is really wanting to be a bridge maker. It wasn't a new thought for him, but it is certainly something that he advances. And to say that there is much still to be done in employing the work that Torrance did in bridging the worlds of theology and the sciences together, but to recognize that even in Alistair McGrath's book, T.F. Torrance, An Intellectual Biography, chapter 9 is called Theology and the Natural Sciences. And here, as part of the development of who Torrance is, there's going to be a discussion that includes this book on page 198. We may begin our exploration of this matter considering the origin of Torrance's interest in relation to the natural sciences and Christian theology. Torrance published relatively little of this matter before the 1959 Hewitt Lectures. So that's the source that we'll see in the preface today in getting something published in a significantly extended form developed in 1969, which we know here as Theological Science. In the light of Torrance's subsequent development, his early view on the intersection of natural science and theology are of considerable interest. These have been overlooked by those who explored Torrance's understanding of the relation of science and religion, and who have, in consequence, allowed to be understood that Torrance's interest in this area was a relatively late development. He then goes on to discuss the Auburn Lectures, 1937, 38, I think it was, and other works. So the argument that he's making here, which we won't go through today, is just that though this work appears at this time in Torrance's life, his interest began some 30 years earlier. So I will invite those of you who spent time with Torrance along the way, just if you have insights on that, just the development, the roots of Torrance's interests that gave rise to this particular book, and maybe broadly the nature of theological science. I would welcome any comments just to enrich what we have as a background for this text. So Bruce, Ken, Bryden, any of you, if you want to say something at that point.
I just have to say it's enormous. It's absolutely enormous. And I mean, not only is the book a little fat, the fact that the preface, as we'll see, Marty, you're going to lead us through, went into so many different renderings. And I mean, it's what I find daunting is that it's a multidisciplinary problem. And at the end of the day, in the prayer that I tried to offer, you have this extraordinary word wonder. And I mean, that is for me the key to what is actually happening here. This wonderful encounter with the living God. Abraham right through to Jesus and beyond. I mean, it is just mind-blowing. Anyway, that's enough. Ken, over to you, mate.
Thank you.
So I arrived in Edinburgh in fall of '73, green and only tutored in the liberalism of New England. I didn't go to Princeton. And so I remember describing to him at one time, it was as if he were racing through the hallways of my mind, throwing open trunks and pulling out things, ideas and thoughts that I had, materials that I had read, said, this is how they all fit together. This is how they all fit together. Don't you? And gotta go, and on down the hall. So that I thought, this is someone I need to read more of. Slow it down, take the pace. But I did notice, at least in the text for today, that when I took the introductory dogmatics lectures taught by the faculty, James, Ken and Walls, and Tom, these epistemological points were the ones that Tom was laboring to get across to every beginning student coming through, that you know things by what they are, and they reveal what they are as you ask questions appropriate to their subjectivity and their objectivity, and revise your questions and question your questions. Questioning your questions has become a motto that I put up over everything, and that came from there.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken.
Can I toss in just one other thing that I find intriguing?
Go for it.
In parallel to Tom Torrance, there's that other polymath, Bernard Lonergan. And our Canadian seems to have disappeared, which is a shame, because he was a Canadian Jesuit, died in 1984. And I have to say that I've spent quite a bit of time with Bernard Lonergan and what he would call his general empirical method. And questioning questions, Lonergan would talk about evaluating understandings. And he would say that's absolutely fundamental to any understanding at all, is continuing to evaluate. Then, of course, they lead to what he would call judgments. And judgment incorporates the word action. It's never a passive thing. It's an engaging thing. And I mean, Tom Torrance, what does he do when he retires? He goes off to China. I mean, please, let's not lose sight of what made this dear man tick. Anyway, that's more than enough, Marty. Over to you, mate.
Thank you. I'm just going to read just a little bit out of Elmer Collier's How to Read T.F. Torrance, Understanding His Trinitarian and Scientific Theology. And I think it's important to recognize that the inclusion of the scientific there is important, to recognize that we can't see Tom as just a theologian that didn't engage the rest of what it means to be scientific, but that it is in his bones, so to speak, in his blood. So the first mention that is made of Torrance in his scientific mode is on page 22 of this book by Elmer. He says, a theology is scientific not when it conforms to the presuppositions or procedures of a universal science, parenthesis, there is no universal science in Torrance's perspective, end parenthesis, or even of the other special sciences, such as natural science. Rather, in Torrance's mind, theological science, like every special science, has its own particular scientific requirements and material procedures determined by the unique nature of its object or subject matter. In fact, for Torrance, there are only particular special sciences with certain formal similarities. For instance, the method of any particular science has to be determined by the nature of its object. As human inquiries within the same space-time universe, those similarities constitute general science, which has no independent reality at all without the existence of the special sciences. While special sciences can, of course, learn from one another, as Torrance has from natural sciences, each individual science must allow the nature of its object to be the controlling factor of every aspect of that science. And so this journey of what we're looking at is to recognize the nature of how the word science has to be allowed to be flexible in light of the discipline that will be formed by the nature of the object of our study, which in this case is the nature of God. One last sentence here. Thus, theology can be scientific if God is knowable and when theology proceeds in accordance with the nature of its object, when it allows actual knowledge of God to determine the appropriate mode of knowing, to disclose the inherent relations in that knowledge, and to generate the conceptual structures and their interrelations appropriate to that knowledge. So again, I think that's just laying a backdrop, the rootedness of a method that we will hear echoed and clarified as we go through this book. That is about what does science mean and how do we begin to use the word science and already be putting in footnotes. If it's going to be true science, it has to be allowed to be true to the nature of the object. And if we simply disallow the nature of God to be studied because we say that God can't be put under our microscope or captured in our telescopes, then there's something about the nature of who God is as God gives himself to be known that has simply been excluded, and that is a prejudgment, or more pointedly, a prejudice that is keeping us from being scientific. So the broad direction within which this book is wanting to take us is to acknowledge there is reality. It is not all immediately present or known to us, yet we exist as communities of investigation. We exist as those who are persons doing that investigative work, and Torrance is focusing us in a place that has too long been in the shadows, when in fact it is the very source of the light of knowing. So I see that there are people who are already putting up notes here. Oh yeah, there's a note on the Internet Archive. I think you have to maybe sign up for the Internet Archive. I don't believe they charge you for it, but I do think that it is available there. And so anyway, if people are wanting to have sections of this, I'm not going to be able to print the whole thing going through it for people to read and look at. But if there are sections, I can scan and send that. There are copyright rules I want to try and stay within. So anyway, there are copies available that one can get to this. And I was hoping that we would have someone maybe today who's used the Internet Archive. Brian says free account to log in, then you can search. I think I did just try and do a search within the book for topics, and you can search without logging in. So there are capabilities that one can have at that level. So again, today we're looking at this preface, and one might ask, why do you spend so much time on a preface? And the fact of the matter is there are two prefaces, and one of them is quite long and quite foundational for understanding the whole nature of the book. And the second one is short. And when I asked Todd to do this, which again, Todd is buried underwater and doesn't have running water and a few other things back there in North Carolina, which is why he's not able to be with us today. Though I'm hoping to have him on just to talk about his personal experiences with Tom at Fuller Seminary, to talk about what he saw as formational thoughts in working with Tom when he was at Fuller. So that's still yet to be put into one of the open spaces. The second preface is relatively short, 2 pages long. Todd didn't think it's that important, but I think that there are things that are worth noting there. So we will attempt to do that as we go through today. Travis will be with us in a little bit here. He had some other commitment that he said. I'll show up at 1:30. So Travis, I consider a specialist in the world of Torrance studies around science. So he will also be able to add to our discussion. I do have many of the sessions filled. I'm still looking for people to guide us through sections that we will have as we go through this book. And we will be looking every other week at a section of this book. I wanted to take an appropriate time, going anywhere from 10 to maybe 30 pages to be covered. Those are listed in the schedule on the TF Torrance Fellowship website under the reading group. I already have the schedule of them. And we'd have people like Gary Detto and Paul Molnar and Jerome Van Kyken and Travis and others who already have taken sessions, but I have open sessions. If anyone has interest in taking one of those, please feel free to let me know. Back to the preface. So in this preface, there are 21 paragraphs. The handout that I did up is basically going through those paragraphs and attempting to give brief notes on what it is that that each of these holds. So before we dive in there, I'm hoping that people will also have the text. Hopefully you did download the text that I posted of the preface, and that if there is anything that I missed, please bring those things out. We want to be as clarifying here as possible. And as Alan Torrance often said in his opening first session for a class, if you think somebody else in this class may not understand something, just stick your paw up for their sake so that we can clarify for them what it is that needs to be noted. So again, there might be your own interest. There might be something that you just recognize that you've found clarity on a topic over the years that would be helpful for others to know. So I just really want to have these sessions be really helpful for the future and clarifying the points as we go through them. Just noting then in the preface, the first paragraph, that there were lectures at Union Seminary, Andover Newton, and the Episcopal Theological Seminary around 1959 that were the basis of his formulating these thoughts into the form of lectures. And so lectures often do give way to becoming books. I'm working on a number of books right now that are grounded on classes and so forth that I'm teaching in the church that hopefully will ultimately become a series in relational theology and scientific relational theology. The material was presented both at Princeton and Edinburgh. What years would you have presented those at Edinburgh? Not the years that you were there, material from this work? It would have been before 69, I guess, probably. So the book would have been printed, Bruce, like when you were there. Yeah. So the question that was of great concern to him, that he wants to bring out, and again, the A in this is paragraph 1, B is paragraph 2, and C is paragraph 3. So if you're in the preface itself, Roman numeral page 8, the third paragraph begins there in discussing the meaning and place of authority in his second series of Gifford lectures delivered in St. Andrews during the session of 1927-28. My revered teacher, A.E. Taylor, called for the locating of authority. Now, one of my questions is, do any of you have any background knowledge on A.E. Taylor? I didn't do any research on him. Is there anything you can add to who A.E. Taylor was and what he might have done in inspiring Torrance in this
Medical
direction?
plan sounds reasonable and conservative. There are things like
I think that was maybe John who was talking there, but he has now gone mute. That's good. So does anybody know anything about A.E. Taylor? No, no
It
Taylor.
looks like Bruce is heading to the volume on Scottish theological biography, and that
Okay.
should.
Did you find something there, Bruce?
Right, I've just got here, I've got the Dictionary of Scottish Church History and Theology.
That's it.
Okay.
And A.E. Taylor, Wesleyan Methodist, international reputation as a Plato scholar, published works chiefly in moral philosophy and the philosophy of religion. His main work, Faith of a Moralist, adopted the familiar post-Kantian idealist view that morality requires and finds its fulfillment in religion. Morality is grounded in the undeniable facts of human experience. In his idealism was a marked strand of Augustinianism. And that's about it.
It's quite interesting, just the next words that appear on the page because of that. Ken, did you want to say something?
As I think what his point here is that even a Platonist who have the reputation for getting high and foggy and remote and abstract when it comes to morality, he makes the point as a moralist that his ethics is grounded in what he regards to be concrete morality or concrete reality. It is not utterly relative or speculative, there was a lot of that stuff going around in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. So everybody read Nietzsche wrongly and decided that they would make up their own moralities because they were just as good as anybody else's.
Right. Good. Thank you. And again, so just again, you're clarifying the point that I want to be really focusing on because it's foundational for everything that follows from here. And that is this locating authority neither in individualism nor in some institutional seat, but in a reality that is wholly given and transsubjective and simply and absolutely authoritative through its givenness. So to say that there's this spark that is lit that is going to go through here that Torrance seems to be suggesting, and Travis can further enlighten us on this, that this theme of not collapsing to individualism is that the individual experience becomes dominant, the human lens becomes the dominant motif, and that science is going to not do its work if that becomes the case. In an institutional seat, there are many schools of thought as well as particular schools that become dominant. And so you get logical positivism, for example, for a school, and it begins with human observation. And so there is this dividing line that is opened up at this point that I think Torrance is reflecting on, that even somebody like Taylor can recognize we must begin with givenness to do proper science, and then to later on to say the nature of the givenness of God in the person of Christ, therefore, is appropriate by virtue of its very givenness. So Travis, welcome. I wanted to say hello to you and acknowledge your presence here. And Dwayne's good to see you back from Canada. We have people from all over the world here. It's rather exciting today. The scope with Scotland, Ireland, New Zealand, Canada, all over the United States. So anyway, the question I wanted to ask you, Travis, is do you know anything more about A.E. Taylor in terms of his impact on T.F. Torrance?
I'm afraid I do not. I did, as I was reviewing this day, I was thinking, boy, I should probably look up those Gifford lectures.
Good. Well, we've done some initial looking at it. Bruce read us something out of a dictionary, and Ken gave us some insight into maybe the direction of what it is that Torrance is doing, and identifying that there is something in the mind of Torrance that is wanting to use even people who might be seen as otherwise, that there is a clarifying of direction that is important for the work that this book is going to unfold. And that we can't begin by excluding anything of givenness, I think is how I might phrase that. All of givenness must be subject to the work of scientific thinking. And therefore, for somebody to say, well, I'm a scientist and you're just a person of faith, a phrase that I've kind of adopted for myself is to say, science is to the created world what faith is to the personal world. Both of them are a reflection on reality that require the human to engage, indwell, and reflect. That science has made itself objective and excluded the personal world. Faith isn't just some wishy-washy term about somebody believing something, whether it's provable or not. Faith is engaging reality, particularly personal reality, or particularly as persons, one might add to that, and to then be able to reflect thoughtfully and carefully in communities to make sure that we're really engaging and clarifying the nature of the whole of science, the world of objects and the world of persons. So I think that's all somewhat implicit then in what we're looking at in this third paragraph. So reality is given by what is other, he's going to suggest. It's received. Again, the whole nature of science, I remember in my earliest lessons in school, the experimental method, we investigate, we observe, and there's just this subtle sense that we are the ones who are in control, and we go looking for what's of interest to us. And there's some things that might be of interest. Look at those things, and all those other things that don't interest you, well, those can, somebody else can pursue those. So I think there is really a call to clarity that the nature of the givenness of reality is that we receive it as something that is given, and therefore it has some call on us to be thoughtful and careful, and may I even use the word complete, in not leaving some things aside as though they may not matter. Bryden, I see that hand.
Thanks, Marty. I want to go back to your definitions, plural, if you like.
Yes.
My difficulty with them is this. Any scientific enterprise, whatever the subdiscipline, involves faith.
Absolutely.
And also the problem with not understanding the fact that science involves faith is that the human knower in science is just as significant as my relationship with a bloke called Marty, actually. And I think the very way we frame the question, going back to that evaluation business, the way we frame the question about personal relationships and how we frame the similarity and the overlap with the natural sciences determines a rejigging of our basic grammar. And I think that I would have to insist upon that again and again and again, because otherwise, even your word personal becomes immediately individualistic and subjective in our common use of the word. So I'm kind of, I've got my antennae up at this point and I go, yeah, because not because I disagree with what you.
Yeah, my article in Participatio is making the point that you're making, right? On the nature of Torrance's resistance to personalism. Personalistic says that we maintain an appropriate balance and faith in that. So keep going.
So anyway, sorry to kind of, what spins my wheel with Torrance is that he does what Polanyi does: science, faith, and society. That absolute classic of Polanyi's quite early on in his career.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's enough.
Good. So to say, going forward, we're going to recognize faith is not something that is merely an abstract belief of a person. It is rather the groundedness of the person in investigation of the world, no matter what part of the world one deals with. So faith seeking understanding, fides quantis intellectum, Barth's early work particularly, is to say science is faith seeking understanding. The nature of what we call theology is faith seeking understanding. They are all the human scientia. Science is the human knowing of that which is other than oneself. And the point that he's making in this paragraph is that we receive it. We don't in any way grasp it, go after it. It is not as though we are the authority. the nature of that which we study has an authoritative basis of being, in the case of God, who God is that we simply discover, and in the nature of the voiceless world, as Torrance I think sometimes will refer to, that the fact that God has a voice should make it much easier for us to do scientific work, and the fact that the voiceless world, the world of objects, doesn't have a voice, should require greater humility. But unfortunately, science has often co-opted being a voice for the world and reading in levels of meaning and understanding that, again, have the very same problems that Torrance is wanting to address. Humans using that knowledge for their own purposes and not really being true to the object of their study. Does that fit for you, Bryden? Perfect.
I think the phrase "the priest of creation" that Ground and Grammar begins with is pretty basic.
Yes. Yeah.
That's all.
Good. Thank you. I want to read. Matt says he's at Starbucks, so it may make it hard for me to hear from my end if I try to talk, but I wanted to share that our 11-year-old son, Jack, has a quiz on the scientific method in school today. He goes to a Christian school, but I noted that in his quiz prep, I heard definitions that seem more centered on the observer as defining the parameters than on what is being observed defining the parameters. Beautiful. So to say this is still being taught to our children, and so to say there is a nature of what one might call prejudicial thinking, that science only studies a particular element of the world. We are the observers. There are authorities who will tell us what is true, it is not true there. And the nature of persons are basically excluded from that, particularly God. But even, I'm still waiting for the day when it becomes reading, writing, arithmetic, and relationships. That we would study the nature of what it means to be in human relationships in thoughtful, intelligent kind of ways that would further the nature of being explorers, and that that are even at a young age we would begin to recognize that decision making and negotiating, listening to others, that those would all be worthy subjects for scientific investigation that could be taught in kindergarten. So anyway, that's, they're just my dreams. Maybe I'll have to write the textbook for that. So the phrase "not constructed from our thinking" encapsulates much of what it is. And I think it was Ken, you were the one that used the word virus, I think. The nature of a virus constructed from our thinking, that is the virus that is kind of like the pandemic, that the world has been led to believe, I think based on Descartes and Kant and so forth, that our thinking should be the ground of all investigation, and our thinking has a capacity for construction of reality that leads to a point where there's simply a loss of anything other than social constructivism that collapses to the individual. We could say with Peter Berger, there is a sacred canopy. There are ways that as cultures we do shape understanding, but when it collapses down to my truth, your truth, that is the construction of reality at an individual point that is merely a fracturing of knowledge, and it leads to a loss of what it means to be persons, basically, not to mention not knowing God. If that's not too broad of a statement. So, the last sentence in there, Professor Taylor held that we might entertain hope for a future of theology as a genuine, assured, and yet progressive science of God. So there's a hopefulness in that statement that he apparently got from Taylor, that there was something possible, that T.F. Torrance himself said he thought that may be possible for the social sciences someday. This was in the letter that he wrote backing up John McMurray being knighted, which McMurray wasn't, but he said that McMurray had the best proposal of this progressive hope to someday there being a science that was properly grounded that included the social sciences, but he hadn't seen it really fully developed in his lifetime, and he probably would say today that it's still yet to fully be done. So the word authority again is this, in a sense, the central statement of this paragraph. I just want to make sure authority is, who is the one who has the ability to say something that is true. The authority is the one who can ground something that is true. And so in this establishment of authority, ultimately it's going to be that which is studied, which grounds that. Therefore, God is going to be the authority. The nature of the reality of the natural world has authority over our views of it. And so we have to keep coming back. Have we really understood the world as it functions? And Einstein for Torrance is going to be somebody who clearly kept saying, I think we're missing the nature of the world as it is because we put it in our boxes, i.e. Newton's view of science. And we need to let reality, the nature of the world and its relative nature, teach us as to what it is that it is. So the nature of construction that's the on-ramp to what might be called natural theology or idolatry or any of those things that Barth saw as problematic, that if you don't begin with the view of being taught by the authority of reality, you will simply read things into it that are not true any longer. And I can hear Torrance saying, let God be true and every man a liar. He said that in a number of his lectures, and I think it's at this point. So the preface here is really drawing some clear lines. We need to go with reality and not fall into the sandpit of our own thinking as the basis, the foundation for what finding the truth and living in light of the truth might look like. And I'll kind of stop and pause between paragraphs to see if anybody wants to say anything before I move on. So I'm moving on to paragraph 4 at the bottom of.
I have a
Yes.
quick
Yes.
comment.
Yes.
On the one hand, who can be against, understanding reality as it is?
Yes.
I guess the issue is not that people don't want to, but it's like people have concluded that we cannot know reality ultimately. And that is the reason why, there is all this kind of churning, I guess. And that the second comment I have is more of a question is, in this time period, 1959, was Torrance specifically thinking of the community, addressing or moving in a certain direction? And this is a kind of a counteraction to that. Does anybody have any ideas on that? Because the preface doesn't, obviously is saying what he's going to do, but he's not critiquing the current situation at that time.
Good. Well, thank you for that. And the whole idea of the anti-realists, Don Cupid, I remember Alan Torrance talking about cupidity, rhyming with stupidity as his statement of what the anti-realist of Cupid was doing. And so to say the trend of anti-realism is a real threat that you're pointing out, which is absolutely true. Bruce, Bryden, yep. Do you have any comments on the context against which Torrance is writing?
No, really. Just apart from one observation, I think in the 1950s he was quite involved with the certainly in commenting on the Faith and Order papers from the World Council of Churches, and so it is possible that as he surveyed all the material that was going through these particular channels, that certainly edged him into a sort of deeper and revived his interest in a proper apprehension of reality as opposed to some of the things that he was reading from WCC. But I just put that forward as a possibility.
And we've got Bryden. I think it was first Ken, then I'll come to you. Go ahead, Bryden.
Sorry, Ken. I think I was brought up in UK at this point, and I do remember very markedly the influence of existentialism, the influence of hope after the Second World War, and the economic prosperity that was emerging. And you get the reconstruction of Europe, you get the reconstruction of the whole business of now we can get on with living. Now, living became in the 1960s a very heady affair. And by the 1970s, that's when you get the anti-realism stuff beginning to really kind of take root in a mass culture. And I would say that two things seem to be at loggerheads. Your word churning, I love it, thank you, is you have an existentialism on the one hand, and yet you had a materialism and a growing prosperity on the other. And these two literally churn because they are not exactly opposites, but they don't sit well together. One is very individualistic and personal in that sense, but on the other hand, materialism is productivity, it's technology, it's expansion in an extraordinary way. We now see it in the form of consumerism and individual choice, but that's to kind of take it beyond the 1950s and 60s. Yeah, go for it, Ken.
Yeah, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I've experienced this, and also reading Karl Barth, writing in the same era. He's very much taken up with the World Council of Churches and the prospect of a Roman Catholic ecumenical council. He's got students that are talking to him. Everybody's talking about it, and they're all trying to say, how do we talk about the relative value of other religious traditions without asserting an absolute value of my position or the biblical position or the atheist position while doing this? We need to be able, how do we insist that it is rational to stay open to variability in the stuff we're putting forward because we're dumb and God is not? This, all of these, that's part of what Taylor was trying to say back in the 1920s, that everybody was trying to recruit Plato as their ally to say, agree with me or you're stupid. And Plato says so. Plato could be cited as the ultimate relativist, or Plato could be cited as the relative absolutist. And that was all from people bringing their baggage to Plato. Having seen the damage that this kind of obstinacy could do to the objective understanding of Plato, probably warned a lot of people, just let's back off and be careful. In the 1960s, it was, the institution was the Roman Catholic Church, which was already in itself questioning. We are infallible and we are inerrant, and oops, we have made mistakes. How do we deal with that? How do we assert our qualitative authority as the one commentator on the truth of God, and admit the mistakes we have made and have made and have made and have made? They had to deal with that while arguing with Protestants who've been pointing at them for 500 years to say, you know, you made a theological mistake all back in the 1500s when you defined righteousness, justification, these kinds at the Council of Trent. People of goodwill, people of ecumenical disposition, people who are willing to say, you know, this is a little bigger than me, have been willing to talk to one another charitably. And I keep going back to George Hunsinger's book on talking about Karl Barth with charity, is that we need to, all of us, be talking to one another with charity, because we didn't get it right the first time. We didn't get it right the second time. We're now on the 127th time, and we're still not getting it right. But boy, are we a whole lot closer together than we were when we started. So that for Taylor here in the 1920s, it was just saying, look, yeah, I am as good a Platonist as you or anybody else. I know the texts. I can quote them in Greek, so just shut up. But I am not willing to see Plato used as the absolute relativist, the atheist who just, I don't know, let the Socrates go on the one hand or on the other, either or, yes, no, or I am not willing to see Plato used as a bludgeon to beat down everybody who, in a sort of an Augustinian way, absolutized and beat down as the definition of really good philosophy, the philosophy we ought to be listening to rather than Aristotle. So that's
Okay. Thank you.
this is what Tom has been right here, and at this time, Tom has been working more than 10 years in ecumenical theology as a convinced Scottish Presbyterian who wants to see ecumenical communion with the Church of England. So he is willing to assert authority and relativity at the same time, because as far as he's concerned, Jesus Christ is both the reality and the invitation to change that both sides need.
Beautiful. Thank you. Travis, I'm going to go to you next there.
We're talking about context, what's going on at this particular point in history. And I think there's also a very important context for the philosophy of science that's going on at about this time. Because we'll talk about realism and anti-realism. And between the giving of these lectures and the publication of the lectures, there's a massive sea change in what do people mean when they say realism and anti-realism. It's in the early 1960s that you see both in 1962, the publication of Grover Maxwell writes about the ontological status of hypothetical entities, which kind of sets the stage for a very particular view of scientific realism going forward. And you also have, in that same year, you have the publication of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which defines an extraordinarily different variety of anti-realism than was common before. So by the time Torrance is giving these lectures, to say anti-realist is basically to say positivist, or radical empiricist. By the time he's writing this book, and I don't think he's had a chance to respond to it really yet, you have a whole different vista of what does it mean to be not a realist that is more nuanced than he's had. So the point, though, is that in this very next paragraph, he's going to talk about the idea of having science and meta-science, not because God's a problem, but because we are. There's a very strong parallel to this idea of why do we need a science and a meta-science just in the natural world. And part of it's because we cannot read reality off of our bare experiences, as some positivists and empiricists were trying to say. And so we have this going on in the background as well. So I wonder if Torrance is fighting multiple fronts at the same time and trying to give a unified answer to all of them at once.
Thank you. Bryden, I'll go for you, and then I have a personal story to reflect on what Travis just said. Go ahead.
Thank you, Travis, because that cued me into something I was wanting to flag. Not only do you have Thomas Kuhn, but you still have Karl Popper. And I mean, the interesting thing about Karl Popper is that if I can claim him slightly, he fled the First World and came to New Zealand during the Second World War. And I mean, people tend to forget that, because during that time, what did he write? Enemies of the Open Society. Now, why do I cite Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper? Because of the debate that erupted between them. And it seemed to me that the institutional victory of Thomas Kuhn has still kind of left a legacy. And in fact, Karl Popper, I think, won the debate. Now, that's a controversial view. It's a minority report, but it's a very significant thing to bring to the table right now in terms of the institutional momentum of whether it's academia or whether it's the Roman Catholic Church or whatever it is. I mean, Ken's list. I mean, what a list. We are on the 128th, we're on the 138th, because of the institutional momentum that we think we must belong to. And I think, for me, that was the verdict of the Thomas Kuhn versus Karl Popper debate. Anyway, that's my tuppence worth.
Very good. My own father taught high school science at Roosevelt High School until he retired. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister. He did his undergraduate work at Pacific Lutheran University, did a master's degree at Seattle University, which is Jesuit, and in the early 1970s converted out of Christianity. And it was the word empiricism. I'm an empiricist. I can only believe in what I see. And so, I mean, what we're talking about here very much, he had all the rootedness in his upbringing that would have suggested that he had received, good theological grounding. My grandfather was actually called under heresy charges for advocating universal reconciliation in the Seattle Presbytery. So he was of the stripe of the very gracious theological. He wasn't, the hard line hell and damnation. He was everything of grace. And yet for my father, there was something that was missing intellectually. And so he did talk about his conversion out of Christianity, which sent me on a lifetime of really asking the question, how does theology and science interrelate? There is something about science that is missing what I, view as the relational dimension, that who we are as humans and persons is significant. I think my dad was challenged relationally because of that. And yet he was one of those people who would help the neighbor quite happily. Right. But I think he became lonely in his later years. And I think it was that his science became so, objective, and he held on to something that he wanted certainty for, that lost the dimension of the personal away. That is what happens, I think, when you lose what it is that Torrance is advocating here. In his final year, I still remember him quoting. He could quote whole psalms from memory, in his 80s, and he didn't just quote them; he quoted them with a tear running down his face. And so, the nature of what it is we're looking here at, the fracturing of science from the nature of theology, to say that there was something of the theology that was still able to touch deep in who he was in the remembering of Scripture, but his mind, in a sense, had become clouded by something that is what Torrance, I think, is addressing for us here. That these worlds must not be broken apart, and the nature of the groundedness of our meaning is in the concrete givenness of the other, who is the God who comes to us. So anyway, that's right in that, it was late 60s, early 70s that kind of was happening for him. So my journey has lived as an echo of that as well.
Marty, can I just come in? I think, all these things are important, but the data, whether we call it empirical data or you use another term on which we build our knowledge and make our constructions, I think it's significant that, as I understand him, T.F. Torrance found it inconceivable that he should ever think that God was not real. When he was interviewed by the journalist Johnson Mackay just before he became moderator of the General Assembly, this came out very strongly, and I think Johnson Mackay sort of challenged him, saying, there are people who find belief in God and faith difficult. And as I remember it, Tom's answer was simply that it was just inconceivable for God not to be real, and therefore that was the datum from which he started. So he always started from that unassailable fact, and he did his theological science from that unassailable fact. Yeah. And so for him, the reality of God was as much an obvious fact as this cup on my desk is for an empirical scientist. And I think we always have to bear that in mind when we're looking at how he understands science, and as he understands the basis for theological science in the givenness of God. For him, the givenness of God, the giving of God was such that God was unassailably real in his life, had always been, and I think always was. And so he starts from that position.
Yeah.
Go ahead. That's crucially the part, and on page 9 there, he talks about speaking personally for a moment. He can't, to deny God's existence would be like his rationality become detached from reality. And I think that's fascinating because that's one of the things that he talks about throughout this book is actuality has to come before possibility. And then on top of that, if we were to say to any other scientist in any other field, let's say someone's a physicist, and say, hang on, before you can tell me about the physical world, you have to prove to me that the physical world exists, but you're not allowed to appeal to any physical reality. You can only appeal to other things. At which case, I don't know how you would begin to do that. In the same way, if it's like, oh, prove to me that biological entities exist, but you cannot appeal to anything biological to do so. The imperative reason is not that theological claims are not subject to the same scrutiny as other claims. It's that there seems to be this cultural expectation that theological claims should be subject to something else. Now, take someone like Alvin Plantinga and some other folks who talk about voodoo and astrology and throw them as almost swear words. And it's like, okay, that means at some point in this conversation, we have to be allowed to take voodoo and astrology as seriously as possible on its own terms and see, does it even make sense if we assume that it's given? And if it doesn't, that's a different problem. But we do have to be careful that we don't simply assume a priori that views with which we disagree cannot possibly be correct, because if it is possible for something like voodoo or astrology to be a science, it would have to be proved on its own terms and not necessarily saying you can't prove that voodoo is real without appealing to voodoo reality. So it's one of those things where that is also humility that I think is important, and it's difficult because we don't want to affirm voodoo and astrology. We don't want to even give them a hearing, and yet we often find ourselves on the opposite side of that prejudice as well.
Yes. And that echoes Carrie Magruder's statement that the history of science must include the whole history, including Babylonian visions of the heavens and the nature of what it is that the Greeks thought of the nature of reality. We have to acknowledge all of it, and as you're saying, to trace the nature of what gets weeded out and not just end up with what we hold to be true, that we become Boltzmannian. We only accept those things that are accepted by the modern mind, and we miss the whole story leading up to it, including often things that shouldn't have been missed. Right? So I think these are all worthy considerations to bring into the nature of what Torrance is doing, not only to be an advocate for theology, but an advocate for better science. Right? And this is one of the things that we hope for the churches today, is that we not only have better theology, which has challenges, but that when people say, well, science says, that there would be some reflective, what are we saying when we say science says? And the nature of the word fact, it's Parker Palmer's book, in his book, To Know As We Are Known. He says the word fact, we've made it to be this unassailable kind of term, when in fact the word fact means human made. Artifact, manufacture, all of them are the terms of the human making of things. And so it's something that we've made, and it's the best conclusion we may have at this point on something, but it is a human made statement, and therefore the word faith and fact are virtually the same thing. If it's a faith that isn't a faith in something, then it's not really faith. And if it's a fact that doesn't have an openness to having an Einsteinian progression of deeper understanding, then it's not really a fact. It's just something that somebody has taken their own authority and detached from reality, and they're holding the fact and not reality anymore. And even the word reality, he says, comes from the Latin word that means to own, which still shows up in a word. Real estate is what we own. And so what is reality are those things that we have come to own. It's just like fact. It's something, yeah, we want to hold it, but the fact that you hold that this is true, it is real for you. If it's grounded in your own human observation, it becomes a default to the same logical problem. You're not really submitting to what reality is. You're just only holding on to what works for you. And so in a world of individualism, where people are only concerned about the impact of reality on themselves, what is real becomes very limited to the scope or sphere of the individual. And so the statement, where is the center of the observable universe? The individual. Right? And that's what we collapse into, is that we lose touch with the reality of the universe and merely default to the observable center itself. I'm going to keep pressing forward here. This is a wonderful conversation. I think it's bringing lots of clarity. Did you want to say something, Kenneth? You're just saying keep moving.
I was going to encourage you. Press on. Press on.
Press on. Okay.
Yeah, more to do.
Paragraph number 4, then, just the whole nature of theology with its positive material content says that there is something of the reality of God that precedes all reflection. And so to acknowledge that the nature of the revelation of God in Christ, that is material content. I'm not merely looking at religious phenomena to say there are many religions in the world, but if we begin with religions, oh, everyone has religious inclinations, then that's not the reality of God. That is, once again, just human mythology at some level. And the Christians are just about as bad in many cases as anyone else. Watch, quote unquote, Christian TV today and ask how much of that is merely religious phenomena that affirms a culture and is not really inquiring into the nature of the God who desires to be known. So our relationship with God requires a scientific theology. What does he mean by that? What is this scientific theology? So that was the fourth paragraph. We must have a scientific theology. That's his last phrase within that. And the problematic is that our relations with God have become problematic. So we must have a scientific theology. So the nature of relations, and again, just to build on a little bit on John McMurray's concepts, that the nature of rationality is based upon our acting in the world. The self is agent. We act in the world, therefore we reflect on the world. And if we make our thoughts prior, then we're simply living out of the cave, so to speak, of our thoughts, and we're not actually acting in a world where we can be taught by the world by virtue of our act in it. We know not to walk into a wall, but to go through a door, because we've been taught that it hurts your nose or something else that bumps up against it. And so we get taught by the world how we function and move, and our emotional engagement, he uses the word emotion here. Our emotion is the being taught by our engagement in the world, so that our reflective thinking is the reason that is founded on that emotional engagement in the world. So McMurray's book, Reason and Emotion, which Torrance is going to appeal to at a number of points, is going to say our reason is merely highly developed emotion, but our emotion comes because we engage the world. And things that aren't true are things that you're just putting emotion on that you haven't engaged in the world. So there's true and false emotion. And so when the nature of our relations to the world are all lived out of our head, then we're not being taught by the world. We're being taught by the fears that other people put into our head, which happens often in Christianity, even about science. Don't trust science. Those people have agendas. And so we are in many cases in Christianity taught to emotionally resist science, rather than seeing what Torrance is doing is saying we need to do them both well by engaging reality and then reflecting on it. The fifth paragraph, which I have as E on page 2 of my handout, personal experience of the presence of the reality and reasonability of God. And so the nature of the reasonability is that, as Torrance has in books like Divine and Contingent Order, is there is an orderliness to the world that one can see the patterns, the nature of the construction of the world. So the human mind has disorder. The human mind needs to be ordered. Our language, our ability to walk, to move, to observe, all of that is an ordering of our mind. And the mind that is ordered by the nature of the God who reveals God's self is that it orders us in a way that corresponds to the nature of who God is. So as Travis just pointed out, we are the problem. We obstruct our knowledge of God. Did you want to say anything more about that, Travis? Because I think it's an important point.
Well, I was thinking about it in the context of, again, what the positivists and other folks were saying. I mean, there was Ernst Mach at one point made the argument that basically what science is just a shorthand version of describing our actual experiences. That and Wesley, or sorry, I've been teaching a class on John Wesley. That was where my head was. But Torrance, in his contribution to the belief in science and in Christian life, which is dedicated to Michael Polanyi, he criticizes a view that says, science is basically just railway timetables and things like that, and phone books would count as it. And I believe it was Ernst Mach who argued that that's basically what science was, just a collection of our experiences. And if that were true, then a naive empiricism clearly has massive problems to it. And because almost always when someone is objecting to philosophy in science, there's almost always a response that, well, just stick to the experiences. The moment you actually try to rigorously stick with experiences, you realize the classic example is, a stick in the water. It might look straight out of the water, but it looks bent in the water due to light refraction. Now, we, of course, can explain what that means, but we don't experience light refraction directly. We have to explain it. And so the idea is we get in the way of our understanding of even our most basic things. Even our what our eyes see and our ears hear is not reality. You can just read off of the surface. We have to probe more deeply to have a robust understanding. So this idea of having a science and a meta-science for our theology should absolutely be expected. We should not be able to understand the deep things of God off of just simply by looking at the text of Scripture, although that's a good first start. Just like looking at creation around us is a good start for science as well. But this idea is because we have problems, because we are unable to see things as they really are, we need to continually check our perspectives, which is part of what we're going to see here throughout the book about things like coherent statements and bringing. We need to take our contact with reality. We need to form it into some kind of coherent view of the world, and then we have to take that and bring it back to bear on reality, because then we're going to find out if we've made a mistake, if we have to refigure it. And if we could simply read truth off of text on a page or out of our sight and sound, then we wouldn't need science. But of course we do, because our problem. So this fundamental, it's the analogy. It's easier to say it in many ways in theology because we know that we are sinners. We know that we are alienated from God and need to deal with that. And the irony, I think, is that a lot of times when we see in natural science some of these points that we see in theology coming up, we should be reminded that if in what is supposed to be as impersonal and as objective of a field as the natural sciences, if even there we have to keep our biases in check, we have to be double checking our own experiences and our own theories, how much more so in these other fields where we know we fall short.
Very good. Yeah. So falling short, I mean, that's kind of part of the gospel. I'm thinking of the book, Walter Wink's The Bible and Human Transformation says, we have so trained people to go and study the Bible that we've forgotten that the Bible's supposed to study us and let us see ourselves and our brokenness so that we become humble and submitted to the nature of who God is. And again, that's your stick in the water type thing. We can't get the right perspective because we're reading from the wrong direction, and we go and we read Webster's on the definition of faith, and it's all about the human and all that. I've literally had students before write papers on, Pauline theology using Webster's, and I, write back, who is Webster? And, what does this have to do with Paul or the nature of what is that's going on here? So again, our inability to read the Bible well is partly, I think you're suggesting, and Torrance certainly would, we haven't learned to read the Bible well because we don't do good science, to let it be a proper scientific book within the mode that it wants to offer that which is scientific. Right? So it's not scientific based on contemporary natural science. It is scientific in its own mode of being that place where the nature of God is revealed as a witness to the church today, to be a scientific community dependent upon it.
I think there's a very
Go ahead.
strong sense in Torrance where the idea is it's not even so much that we're taking our cue from scientists, but that the scientists are reminding us of what we ought to have already known. And in fact, many of the saints of the church had already known. So it's almost like being called back. If there's moments throughout the Old Testament where God says, even these pagan nations understand things that you don't. And it's not saying everything about the pagan nations is good, but the point is, if even they have figured it out, how is it that we have not? So in a similar way, this idea of even these people who are not seeking after God, even they understand the problem of sin because they realize they themselves get in the way of their own scientific understanding. And if even the secular scientists can grapple with what we would call the nature of sin, then by golly, we had better be on board with that too.
Yeah. And the nature of sin can be tricky. In the world of therapy, to say the science of therapy today works with the individual with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And there are developments within what thoughts are, cognitive, emotive, behavioral therapy, but they all begin with the individual. And so when I begin with a couple, I say, I don't take insurance because I don't prescribe to a system that deals with the individual. I only do relationships which comes from the nature of my theology, and it's missing from the diagnostic manual, the DSM 4 or 5. None of them assess the nature of our human being and relationship. Therefore, I'm in a different paradigm, and it's, I think, the point we're making here. I had one person say, I really don't want to talk about theology in these. I'm not a Christian and all that. In the first session, halfway through, he says, "This is exactly what I've been looking for." And it's because I was engaging the nature of the reality of what was going on in a way that he couldn't see from that individualistic perspective. So I'm just agreeing with what it is that you're saying here about what I think can be the helpfulness of a theological perspective that goes beyond the narrow bias of what a scientific quote unquote view can see with its biases. So looking again, the problem then of our obstructing God, God presses at the disorder of our minds. This is what we call metanoia, the changing of our mind. So that is not something we do. That is the nature of the reality of God pressing against our minds through his healing revelation. So, I mean, it's one of these classic things that that particularly evangelical Christianity today, we need to repent. And so it's there's a basic scientific misrepresentation that's present at that point, that we are metanoid, as Alan Torrance said to me. We are transformed because of the reality that we come up against. And so Torrance is, I think, making that point here, that the disordering of our mind can only happen when there is a better way of understanding what it is that's going on. Paragraph F or 6 in the text. Scientific theology is an active engagement with the human mind before God. And the word active here is that it is not merely theoretical, which again, theoretical comes from the same root as theater, which is to stand back and observe. And there, in that standing back and observing, we have what we've noted is what is classically called science in grade schools today, but is one step removed from actually engaging in reality. So the question that Torrance asks, how do we bring clear knowledge of God into focus? How do we apprehend God's reality, which we will distinguish from comprehending, which has a kind of a final statement to it? Apprehend is to become, have accessible to us that which we can begin to explore. So we may not be able to comprehend all that is in the ocean, but you can go to the beach, stick your foot in the water, and you begin to apprehend what is there and the majesty and wonder of it, and hopefully a big wave doesn't knock you over. The third point there, allowing God's eloquent self-evidence. I love the word that he used there, eloquent self-evidence, to sound through us to understand him. So this sounding through, which interestingly the word persona, means to sound through. So in the person of Christ, the person of Christ sounds through the nature of the God who creates, sounds through into a world where there is this engagement of God and the human in a sounding forth, and by the Spirit then we hear what it is that God says to us. So there is a hearing, which one can think of that as one step removed from reality, but it would simply be a choice to remove the sounding through, the hearing of the speaking of another. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. That is the sounding forth of God, by which humanity actually has its very existence, not just at the beginning, but every day. How do we keep from thrusting ourselves onto God, twisting into untruth? Again, this language of Torrance, it's like a dance floor with teenagers who are flailing on the floor and calling it science. They're missing what it means to understand the orderliness of what the beauty of music and dance can look like, and to simply have a form of self-expression which may work for the individual, but doesn't do much to bring us into something of coherence and community. And I think of those cultures that have a community dance, that everyone knows the dance, knows the song. There's something about that, a cohesiveness, that one has to learn into that. One doesn't just have the dance without being caught by that which is other. moving to the next paragraph then, G, which is on page 10 of the preface. Theological science helps refer our thoughts beyond ourself to God. And this is where I think, Travis, your word meta, I'm trying to remember, it was meta knowledge. I can't remember what you used there.
Torrance referred to science, I mean meta science.
So meta is a word that for many people seems to disqualify in a sense. And yet even our knowledge of electricity in our body, is that meta science? Because we don't sense the electricity in our body and yet it is there. Radio waves, is that meta? I mean, where do we draw the line that it's meta and when it's not? And does it matter?
I believe Torrance is talking about the idea of, so the science is our engagement with reality, and meta science is our engagement with our scientific instructions. So it's a second order of language. So the subject of our meta science is our science, whereas the subject of our science is reality.
Right. So when we use the word metaphysical, that's beyond the physical. And to say at one level, God is beyond the physical. And so our meta science is about God being beyond the physical, that God is personal.
I wouldn't press too
I
far
would-
into the term of metaphysics, because that just means those are the books that happen in Aristotle after physics.
Right.
I would just interpret meta in this context as philosophy of.
Right.
That
Okay.
you're thinking about the subject itself.
Good. Okay, and these are the clarifying things that we want to do as we go through of how words meta get used. Obviously, they have different meanings in different contexts. So our thoughts beyond ourselves to God. Normal communication utilizes language with the intention to invite other minds into what is beyond us. So here's the kind of the beginning of the community work of science, right? That it's not just an individual who happens to think about God, that there's this invitation when we use language about God or the world, we are creating the space to invite others into it. And we could almost begin to see the word indwell. We all indwell a reality. The language that we use is to invite others to indwell that reality in a similar kind of way. Somebody who's terrified of diving into the water to say, when you go under there, it's going to be wet and you'll hold your breath. And this will be a young child who you're teaching them to swim. Here's how you're going to indwell that reality, and look, I'll do it so you can see it. And there's an invitational sense that I think the best side of what we do in schools training kids is to understand the nature of the world, so they understand how the world works and things that will hurt them and things that won't, and things that you can eat and things you can't. And there is an indwelling of reality component that is to it there. And language is this tool that helps our minds to engage that. When we are excluded from talking about the Bible or God in public schools in the United States, there's something that just keeps it off the table. And I even think that the nature of not being able to talk about Judaism or Islam means that kids may or may not hear what's going on in the world today, and they are clueless and have no ability to grow into a knowledge that these are humans who think from different places, and that it might be helpful to actually engage those conversations. The second point there, he mentions the triadic relationship of one mind directing another mind to an object. So one mind, the other mind, and an object, and understanding the intention of the first mind. And I think that means to see something that is there. And that may be just simply stated in the first level of the strata of Torrance's thinking, that the act of worship, you invite someone in to begin to hear and experience through scripture, the preaching of the word, another mind, so that people will become exposed to and be able to progress on to the second level of doing the theological work of hearing the address of God through scripture in such a way that a metanoia or a transformation process happens. Is that a fair assessment kind of what he's building a foundation for here?
I don't know. I think he's building this idea he referred to earlier, in an earlier paragraph. He referred to things, let's see, talk about transsubjectivity. Someone here, yeah. So so in that A.E. Taylor bit, he talked about in a reality that's wholly given and trans-subjective. What he seems to be saying is, I encounter God, and you encounter God, and because we are referring to the same reality that is objective to both of us, that it stands in judgment over both of us, and both of our preconceived notions are challenged. But the idea is that it's not just me and my construct and you and your construct. We're both referring to something that's outside of either of us.
Good. So it's an invitation to submitting to reality in a sense that you're inviting
Right.
another person into. Good. So paragraph H then, rationality provides the context for communication to give expression of what is apprehended and pointed to. And rationality, I think, is the orderliness of the world. Is that a fair thing? The orderliness of the world is present there in that? Rationality is not just our rationality, it's that the world has a rationality to it as God's creation that provides the context for us to talk about it, to give expression of what is apprehended and pointed to. So we come to grasp then point one, what can be apprehended with its rationality. We investigate what is disclosed through our questions. So there's something that is there. What is that? What is God saying? Who is this Jesus? Who do you say that I am? That is all the investigation of the disclosure. This wasn't disclosed to you by someone else. This was disclosed to you by my Father who's in heaven. That would be looking at Jesus' engagement with Peter. If the nature of things were not intelligible, meaning I think orderly and able to be apprehended and apprehensible, neither knowledge nor communication could arise. So the very fact that the world is as it is the givenness that creates the possibility for science and theology to actually function. And the fourth point, communication is a persuasion to attune our thoughts to reality, a possible ground for apologetics. Now, he doesn't unpack a lot on apologetics here, but I think the nature that apologetics, when properly done, is that you let reality speak. It's not that you try and convince people out of what's logical to them and try and fit the world or God into it, but that you're trying to conform the nature of the world to the nature of what is there and given. So that for Karl Barth, Jesus is the apologetics of God. He is the one who changes our mind. We can't have some other route or ladder to get to him. Right, I see that hand.
I want to pick up the statement of Torrance's. We communicate with others only when we get them to submit their thoughts to the same rationality in things that we experience. Now, my difficulty is this, or the problematic nature of what we're trying to squeeze here, is that Paul Ricoeur has this lovely phrase which we can translate as the available believable. Okay?
Yep.
So if something is just not socially available, culturally available, linguistically available, and therefore paradigmatically available, then how do we actually engage in a common language that enables communication to occur?
Yeah.
And I mean, this is for me, in a postmodern environment, the absolute core of our dilemma. Now, I love what he's doing. I really do. But my difficulty is that again and again and again, your phrase about the center of the observable universe, well, the center can either be individual or collective. And you get the groups who say, my group is more significant than your group. The very realities of what's going on in Israel, Palestine, etc. at the moment, is we don't even know where to start, because the ignorance, in inverted commas, is so fundamental about the available believable of Islam and the available believable of a Jewish nation that got wiped out nearly in the Second World War. And I mean, never again is the phrase, the Jewish phrase. And I think what's available to be believed is determining so many things today. And the word persuasion the very next sentence. The problem with persuasion is that wonderful word that we had earlier, charity.
Yeah.
Now, the difficulty with charity and persuasion is, when does persuasion become power and mere power? And when does persuasion become a courtesy to invite into a space where we can both grow and change? And I mean, for me, that's a terribly important contemporary problem. Anyway,
Yeah.
I throw it
Yeah.
out there using those two sentences as a
Yeah.
springboard.
And I would just further the conversation by saying, I think for the Christian to say Jesus is Lord is to recenter the center of the universe, and that everyone at some level confesses that he is the Lord, to get at what is truly real and where the center truly lies. That is the Christian claim, that small confession, the shortest of all confessions, is the one that recenters us in a place where we can do the work of theology. And Karl Barth
Oh,
spent some time with that. So
10 out
the
of 10, but my difficulty is that it's my identity politics that's Lord, not your claim.
well, that is the challenge. That's the disorderliness that is really, everything here was pressing up against that.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, to say all of our modes of thinking outside of Christ are all prejudicial. You know, anybody who says somebody else is prejudiced outside of Jesus as Lord, at some level, is confessing their own prejudice, right? And so
Oh,
the
yes. And I
humility
mean,
and the
you've just
graciousness.
expressed yours, you see, because you've said Jesus is Lord. Now, I happen to believe that the probability of the resurrection, which declares him Lord,
Yeah,
is in fact more probable than your probability.
yeah,
Back to the available, believable.
yep.
But I mean, that takes quite a personal engagement over many barbecues and glasses of wine.
Or one Holy Spirit.
Oh, that could be pretty instantaneous. Yes, thank you, Paul. Whoops.
Good. Well, these are all part of the wrestling that I think this whole book is going to deal with, and we are clarifying the challenge at some level here, which is wonderful. And so to say Torrance believes there is a reality and that there is something about the persuasiveness of the nature of the God revealed in Jesus that we can stake our claim on and say reality, we can hold to this. This does make sense in the way that Travis has said, of the nature of the internal. If we take that claim, does it cohere and hold us in a kind of logic that is going to get us where we need to go? And Torrance is going to be arguing for that throughout, I think. The next point then, just scientific persuasiveness cannot be one directional, so we can't persuade from what makes sense to the human. That's the theological science. So we have to do the work that he ultimately calls analogia fidei, that the nature of the groundedness of the work that we do is grounded in the nature and character of God. And by beginning with that starting point, we are then in a place to be taught that the nature of reality can be described and seen. And part of my own work with therapy is to try and do that work that Torrance pointed to say, I think there's something there, but we need to always hold that the nature of what it means to be persons, the nature of what it means to relate as persons created by God, all has to begin with that. It's going to be hard to sell to the world of therapeutic thinking that we have to begin with Jesus. But as theologians, I think that is where we begin, and that there is a logic and persuasiveness that may be compelling, that the outcomes actually make more sense of human experience and brokenness than what it is that the psychological psychiatric models can provide. Though I would say both Torrance and Barth recognize that there are diagnoses that we need those people to do the work they do for all kinds of physical, mental disorders, that we need that language. So don't throw any of them out. Just do the work that we're doing here of clarifying appropriately in context how we understand them so that they are truly dysfunctions, and that maybe we recognize all human beings have mental illness by virtue of needing our minds to be transformed by the renewal of the Spirit into the person of Christ, right? And so if we begin at that, that's another way of saying we're all sinners. But then we're in a place to say, well, what does health look like then? And it's going to be defined by the nature of the God revealed in Jesus and what we are called to be as those who are restored and redeemed. And something like the fruit of the Spirit becomes something that might be a paradigm for health. The clarifying distinctive nature is part of what is going to be throughout this work, is that there is a clarifying, that's the last point in I, that moves us into J. Theological science must be involved in methods of questioning that engage reality, such as philosophy and natural science. In other words, we don't sidestep them, we engage them in ways that I think we could have put in there. The nature of therapeutic work in there as well. I think Torrance wants us to engage all of them, but from a starting point that allows us to be critical in whether or not they engage reality or distract us from reality. In a world of individualism, the level of distraction is at a tsunami level, right? It's blowing over us constantly and bending everyone to winds that are contrary to what it is that the nature of a good theological engagement would look like. So the struggle with our entanglements that he talks about, reality always outruns our experience of it. Our experiences can be confused. Just watch the news for an hour and ask what is true and what is right. We're always directed away from ourselves to be corrected by the force of what we are connected to. And this is the submitting to the reality in the person of God. Point 4 of J, theological and natural science operate with the same tools, using human reason, operating with the given while acknowledging the distinctive. So this is a key phrase, I think, in the whole of the preface, that the tools are the same, the nature of what is engaged is not. And that's where the language of special sciences, that each object at some level needs to be shaped in a way that we're not confusing and overlapping them in a way that merely makes the human an animal, and therefore the animal world defines the human because we are at the base level animals, and saying, no. You're not dealing with the nature of each giving rise to an understanding of it based on its own reality. Point K, the great story of modern thought is the struggle for fidelity. This is the proper adaptation of the human subject to the object of knowledge. And so he talks about a proper adaptation to God, proper adaptation to the world and nature, and a proper understanding of humans. And all of them, I think he would say, we haven't advanced a lot since 1969. And maybe we'd say we've gone backwards. Technology has made us more dependent upon human toys and tools to make us self-sufficient in our individual world. Though one could say the nature of the internet has made us interconnected in a way we never were before, and that has its pros and its cons. There is a web nature of what is there that does acknowledge we are more interconnected than we thought before. Do we abuse it with our sin nature just as much or more? Very likely. The struggle, this is the struggle of humans with themselves, wrestling to achieve their way and imposing on reality. So this is the dominant nature of sin at some level that runs counter to a proper theological and maybe even scientific generally sense of engaging the world. In theology, this is the healing of human relationship before God. That's what's needed. Rejecting individualism, where one lives for self, is fundamental, and the world is not ready for that, I think. Though the Pacific Islands, I mean, this is why I love doing my doctorate in New Zealand. I said they spoke English, but they didn't think American. They really thought in terms of communities of people and what it means to live and support communities. And so I think that there are communities that we still need to learn from what it looks like, even not to collapse into the rugged individualism of traditional Western kind of thinking. And adopting a love for God and neighbor with concern for the other. These are the concerns that overcome what he sees as core problems. He then goes on in L to talk about modern theologians with John Calvin. Travis, do you want to give a brief statement on his logic of switching around the quid sit, on sit distinction there? He's making a major point in Latin and doesn't exactly explain it. I tried to give some of the translation. Go ahead.
Sorry, can you remind me which page we are? I don't have the letters that you've gotten.
let's see here. That is on, it's Roman numeral page 13 in the preface, the bottom
Yeah,
paragraph.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And
So
on
rather
my
than starting,
handout, it's page 5, point
right,
L, modern theology.
right. So he's saying rather than starting with, what is a thing, it's asking what kind of thing is it? And so it's much more of a so in this case, rather than saying like what is God, you're starting with who is God. And that notion, the concrete nature of, we're not interested in who God is in some kind of abstract sense of like a lowercase g God, that's how the nations might call God, but what sort of God is this that we see in Jesus Christ? So in the same way, what that impacts to say is we're going from concrete actuality rather than possibility.
That's a nice distinction there. One begins with the abstract. The what is it is almost the
Right.
Newtonian categories that are abstracted at some level. And the other is the specificity, the concreteness of
Right.
the particular who is before you. Who is this God? What
And
does he
in this
reveal to you?
paragraph, it says, thus, instead of starting with the abstract questions as to essence and possibility, he started, this is Calvin, with the question as to actuality. What is the nature of this thing that we have here? Which in theological knowledge becomes the question as to who God is and as to what he has revealed to himself. So in the same way, rather than saying like, what is this, in the sense of, well, it's these four elements and everything is made up of water, and you go from there, but rather you're saying, what is this particular thing here? And going, reasoning from that point, the concrete actuality rather than the abstract.
Good. Thank you. Good. So his statements then, we speak because we've been spoken to. That's concrete, actual being spoken to. And so then we reflect on that. Theology begins with the actuality that cannot be abstracted. And scientific theology stresses a personal relation to God. He made it sound as though it was quite a recent kind of engagement. I grew up in an evangelical world, so that was the focus of what people often talked about. And maybe that's a relatively recent phenomenon, the beginning of Calvin's Institutes, the double knowledge that is there. One could say he doesn't exactly use the word personal knowledge, but there is a sense of the personal that is within that, I think. Bruce, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I've just looked at my own my old student notes,
Yeah.
and 8th of November 1973. The heading of the section is "Who is God?" And this is what I wrote down from TF's lecture.
Yeah.
Aristotle said that in order to find out about anything, you had to ask 4 questions. How is it? What is it? Whence is it? Why is it? And then he goes on to say modern science brackets off the questions what and how. This is only asking half a question, giving a half answer. We will always come up with a mechanical answer, not the living quality. We must be careful how we ask our questions. And then he goes on, the medievals restricted the questions to 3. What, whither, what kind? A, what is a question as to the abstract essence of it. Could we ask the question, what is God? B, whither is about does it exist? C is about the nature of it. The medievals put essence before existence. And then it goes on to say that we have to ask the question in the proper order. I don't know if that ancient piece of history helps in any way.
No, I think it's very helpful. It's very helpful. I mean, we could talk for some time about that, but it's reflected somewhat in Bonhoeffer's Christ the Center, in his section on the who question, overrides those other questions that he listed there, the what, when, where, why questions, that those ultimately collapse into these abstracted forms of thought. But the who question, which I call the personal question, only the question, who are you, can only be asked of another person, whereas the others can be asked of objects. And so Torrance is doing this, the work there in that of giving the deep rootedness of these ancient forms of thinking that you engage the other, which actually are abstracting rather than the concretizing of what the who question does to engage us in the personal God who comes to us And Jesus' final test question, Peter, who do you say that I am? Is that, that biblical scientific motif of that is our starting point in doing theological science. So that was very helpful, Bruce. Thank you. He goes on then, and I'm on my page 6.3. We must put our knowledge to the test to determine proper knowledge of God and ourselves. The analogy of fide is that does it truly arise out of God, or is it something that is projected onto God from ourselves? So it must be traced back to the ground of reality and fidelity to God. The principle of objectivity allows us to be questioned by the original, which the prayer in the beginning, the God from whom all families derive their names. That's Paul's language of, I bow my knee before the Father from whom all families in heaven and earth derive their names. That's analogia fide. And so the nature of science is that we always see the human use of language and that to which it points, beginning with God and being derived by its human uses. Point M then on page 6 of my handout, modern theology lets the relation of our knowledge of God and ourself get out of hand. And this is the abusive side of modern theology. The analogy of faith is flipped into a gross personalism, which my article in Participatio took exactly that on, that it collapses into just human starting points. And I argue that Torrance, like he doesn't want scientism, but he is happy with scientific. He doesn't like personalism, but it can be personalistic, referring to God as the one who defines the nature of what person might be. That in both cases of science and persons, if God is the defining one, then it can be used appropriately, I think, if you get the ick ending. And I think he particularly is, dealing with Bultmann and others who are taking theology in a way that moves away from God and collapses into the human. Moving over to point O on page 7, hidden idealist presuppositions are being exposed. I think he was saying in the time that he's existing here, he was recognizing that which began with Immanuel Kant and Descartes, beginning with the human, the transcendental unity of apperception for Kant, that we transcendentally observe and out of our thinking project onto and understand the world, that can't be done. That ideal perspective is inappropriate. And for Descartes, I think, therefore I am, that the thinking mind cannot define the world. And so he's calling into question the separated thinking from the world, and that at bottom level, dualism for T.F. Torrance is when you think from the mind and see the world separated. That is the fundamental dualism. And again, George Hunsinger says he has a hard time understanding, because of the many uses of T.F. Torrance, what he means by dualism. But I think that is the nutshell of it right there, is that thinking from the ideal, one separates from the material or physical world, and you fractured it. And then usually you choose between one of the two, either the idea or just the physical world. Or as Alan Torrance said, in the modern university today, you have two basic schools of thought: the world that deals with the physical, and the social sciences that deal with the other. And ne'er the twain shall meet. They don't really engage one another. And they are a phenomenon of a world of dualism that has lost what the schools of theology should do, but they often collapse into the ideal world, right? And so getting beyond that at this point in his preface, I think, is just a recognition of the holism that is so important for Torrance in all of his theological and scientific thinking. Point P, modern science places undue emphasis on the place of the human, which imposes patterns of human nature into the investigation. And again, that's what sometimes Torrance will call mythology, going back to Athanasius with Arius, to mythologyne. I think you're projecting onto God. You're not really letting God speak. And so Torrance suggests that science becomes a technological control of nature. The human uses technology, controls nature for human ends. Science ends up fulfilling human needs based on human perceptions of need, and lose the meaning outside human agendas. And life becomes, he suggests, meaningless. Point Q then on page 8, theological and natural sciences share the same problem. How are we refer our thoughts and statements beyond ourselves to reach a knowledge of reality? We cannot dialogue between science and religion. That's what human romantic naturalism says. We need a dialogue of science and theology in a struggle for methods with a proper ground and space for distinctive fields. And I think that's the graciousness we've talked about, and the indwelling of Polanyi, and all those ways that allow us to continue to clarify the nature of reality with respect for the differences. Point R, this book clarifies the process of scientific activity in theology, which he sees as thinking of God as the proper object of inquiry, seeing the human as addressed, which this again, the whole word, and the word of Barth would be seen there. God is the word who addresses us and by the Spirit gives us ears to hear. Humans are summoned to a faithful, disciplined response to God's word, and that is science. That is our minds are being disciplined to conform to who God is. And stopping romantic irrationality and subjectivity, this is its corrective task. And so to say the church dogmatics, while it's Christologically moving forward, it's always doing the corrective work of showing all the ways that humans in their subjectivity become irrational as far as Barth is concerned, by starting with the human. He then makes a note of Bernard Lovell, who inspired the scientific method for theology. And these are again on just the last three little paragraphs. Does anybody know anything about Lovell that you'd like to say? These are people who inspired him.
My knowledge of
He
Lovell
was
is that he was a famous astronomer, right, at the time.
Yep.
So his grounding in science was pretty good. And I thought he also did a TV show in England at the time talking about the nature of science. So, yeah.
And again, he's noting that he's dedicated this book to Lovell. So he's not just a minor figure, he's pretty major. And he says,
Yeah.
led me to examine more carefully the nature of theology as a science and to select this theme for the Hewitt lecture. So, I mean, this is personally a key point. Bruce, did you have something there?
Yeah, Bernard Lovell, he was the creator of the big radio telescope at George Roll Bank, just outside Manchester, which was quite pioneering in that whole field. He was a distant relative of TF, I think, and TF used to go and stay with him occasionally. And he was also a strong Christian. He used to play the organ in his local church on Sundays and so on, and do a bit of preaching.
Yeah.
And certainly there was a very creative interaction between TF and Sir Bernard. Yeah.
I wonder if anybody's done a biography of him.
Yeah, I think there is.
It sounds like he's a pretty important person.
I know at some point he refers to him. I think it's in Transformation Convergence of the Frame of Knowledge, and I was trying to remember what it was, and I'm just searching around other things. I think that he looked at Lovell as being one of the people who articulated the idea of the anthropic principle. Why is the universe just so? If it was a tiny fraction of an either way. So I mean that's what I get the impression, because he cites Lovell in his Templeton acceptance speech.
Very good. And then in paragraph 20, the next to the last paragraph on that page, there are a number of people, Reverend Dr. Cameron Dinwoody of Longhold. Again, these people I like to acknowledge the quote unquote, the little people who read proofs and prepare things, and Andrew Luth and Ian, his son. I'm indebted to all three of them, so we want to acknowledge them. And then finally, Oxford University Press. Now, I don't know about Oxford University Press that much, particularly at this time, just what its inclinations were to accept the kind of thing that Torrance was putting forward. Was there a sense that Oxford was in a space that was encouraging this kind of thought, or do you have anyone have a sense of that?
I think, yeah, at the time, I think Oxford University Press was publishing a lot of books on theistic aspects of philosophy. I remember, and also they published Plantinga's Nature of Necessity, for example. I
Okay.
believe that's an Oxford. Yeah. So they were not against religion or Christian faith in any
Yeah.
specific way.
Yeah, I mean, Oxford, of course, is where some of the new atheists are from there. So, I mean, to say they are a playground for people to express ideas, and that they did publish this is helpful. Just a few comments then about the new preface. Um, in here, he in composing this work, I was concerned to show that a scientific approach to theology in all its vigorous inquiry, the material content of knowledge must be allowed to determine its form and method, which that in a sense sums up everything we've read so far. This is written in 1996, so it's been, almost 2 decades later that he's writing this, and he's approving of it. Um, the whole nature of the real, grounding what it is that we would call subjective knowledge, which we might use Polanyi's sense of personal knowledge there, that it's subjective by virtue of being personal. Did you want to say something there, Dwayne?
Yeah, actually, I his comment there, even, he simplified and reduced what his intention was, form and method. That's our fundamental problem of everything that we do, because our knowledge of God doesn't correlate to actually represent what we actually know in our minds. That word, act, and being word and act, and like that triadic thing where we have integrity, and without wax, the whole problem, the form and method, like that area is something that we have to constantly go back for, but that's not necessarily what progressive people who are looking just to live, and they already assume reality, and and more, whether individually or the group, and like what that's the fundamental problem there. Like, we have to revisit these things over and over and over again.
Yeah. And that's why we're doing it. Yeah. It's form and method and the object of our study. To let God be the one who is the object is certainly a missing point in the modern world. So he reiterates the need to acknowledge the inherent order and the harmony of the universe. We can't build theological science on natural sciences, so it's getting the proper distinction between theology and natural sciences, that we're querying to present to the modern world a communicable theological science, which the idea of querying, I mean, there's the query is a place where you go and dig up things that have often been lost. And I think, he is doing that already. We've seen in language here, but also just recognize the roots of the people. Querying is a very interesting metaphor, making room for discussion of divine revelation. I mean, this is central to what it is that he feels that he's doing in this work. And in the second paragraph, that there's an era of epistemological transitions. And so, again, some of the things that Travis pointed out here, and Bruce as well, and I guess Ken also pointed out just the things that were going on in the transitions that were there at that point in time. And maybe we're still in transition. There's a lot of people who still haven't read Kuhn, and others. Again, Polanyi said that Kuhn kind of stole his ideas for that book. And so there's a lot of interplay of, who gets credit for these things, and has anybody really heard all of those things and what needs to be said? Paradigm shifts in theology. I think it was Hans Kung wrote a book that is similar to Kuhn's, that deals with the nature of kind of theological transitions, though he wasn't maybe as widely read as what it is that Kuhn had. But theologians and scientists work in the same world. So there's the unity of the world that Torrance wants to pursue, side by side, where God has placed us and where he makes himself known. I mean, that's an inviting everyone to the table, in a sense. Understanding the creator of the universe through his revelation, that is the unique place of theological science. And understanding in the universe out of its rational order, that's where he sees the natural scientists to come to the table and to recognize that we need to understand the universe as rationally designed, without collapsing into design kind of arguments that argue again for God off of the design of the universe. So it's a fine line even to be taken there. his final paragraph, reissuing the book to widen and further discussion into the relation of science and theology at the frontiers of knowledge, which was the name of the series that he published 1982 through 87, I think it was. So, I mean, he likes that idea of the frontiers of knowledge. And I think to say we are still at the frontiers of knowledge. And in going through this book, and Travis is going to take us through the first part of chapter 1 next week. Hopefully it feels 2 weeks away. That's right, 2 weeks away, because I do it every other week so people don't get overcome. Next week, we actually have Mark Cortez with his chapter out of the TNT Clark Handbook of T.F. Torrance. So Mark Cortez will be with us to talk about his chapter there. But yeah, in 2 weeks, we're beginning this journey that still has a sense that it's very frontierish and that it has not had a wide hearing. And hopefully by the discussions that we're having here, it will get others talking about it and maybe asking more questions that we can keep pursuing and bringing to the table. So I want to thank all of you here today. Does anyone have any kind of final insight or thought that you want to throw out there before we sign off? I want to acknowledge that Bruce has made it up to a very late hour in a challenging time. Bruce, thanks for being with us. It's been great having you here. Okay, hearing no voices, blessings on you all, and we will see you we'll see you next week, hopefully. But if you're just doing the series, 2 weeks, and I think this has been great today. Hope you all enjoyed it. Take care.
Thank you for preparing the outline.
You're
Yeah,
very
thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.